Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Women's Health Tech Wednesdays. My name is Nina Joshi, and today I am very excited about our guest. We are bringing on Nathalie, who is the SVP and General Manager of Outcome Science and Services at ConcertAI. As you know, for Women's Health Tech Wednesdays, we love questions. So if you have any for Nathalie during the conversation, please be sure to pop them in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and I will make sure we have some time to get to it at the end of our time together. And so with that, we'd like to formally bring on our guest, Nathalie. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me, Nina.
Awesome. Well, I would love to just jump right into it. Maybe we can start with you telling us a little bit more about your background and your journey that led you into the healthcare industry.
Sure, happy to start there. I knew very early on that I wanted to be in healthcare. I actually, I was thinking about this. I remember reading this book called The Selfish Gene by Richard N, and it's a seminal read for many people. And I kind of fell in love with the field, and I knew I really, there was a complex field where my curious mind could sort of feed off of all this complexity of the human body, and there would be a meaningful pursuit for me. So a few years later, I'm a cancer epidemiologist by training. I was trained at Columbia. I joined Columbia intent on doing research and teaching. And at some point, I was looking for a more fast-paced and innovative environment, and so I joined healthcare consulting.
Wow!
And today, as you said, I head up a phenomenal scientific team at ConcertAI. ConcertAI is a technology and AI-powered real-world data company, oncology company. That has, I'm happy to say, the largest real-world data oncology sample of patients that we work with.
Wow, that's incredible. Well, speaking of, big data and kind of all that can be done with it, would love to kind of get your take, especially kind of coming from your background as an epidemiologist. I think we've seen a growth and an acceleration of big data, I think in general, but of course, the pandemic and everything really sped that up, I would imagine. Would love to kind of get your take of what are some of the other factors that you've kind of seen that have accelerated the use of big data, and how ConcertAI is utilizing big data and applying it to healthcare outcomes in a meaningful way.
For sure, and I think it's a question a lot of people ask themselves these days. I've had that question asked many times. Real world data has been used for many years. It was used for safety surveillance after approval for many years. And real world data, again, it's the use of EMR, whether it's the use of EMR or claims data or registry data outside of clinical trials to represent the clinical practice sort of experience. I think there's a few time points that accelerated the use of real world data. In 2016, the 21st Century's Cures Act really sort of put on the map the fact that real world data could be used for innovation, could be used for research, could be used to inform care. And it had a very important impact. All this field that I'm part of, the healthcare consulting field, or healthcare field, sort of took this as an open invitation to increase the robustness of the real world data and look for ways in which you could increase its use. COVID-19, you're right, it did accelerate that, because during COVID-19, a lot of people were staying away from hospitals, staying away from patient clinics, and often real world data was the only way in which you could have continuity of care through telemedicine or or any passive use. So that real world data really provided the continuity that the clinical trial field was struggling to provide.
Mm. No, I think that makes a lot of sense.
Recently, as I'm sure most of you are aware, recently the FDA published 3 guidances at the end of last year. And in those 3 guidances, they really sort of took it to another level. They said, this is the expectation we have of what robust real-world data should be and looks like.
Right.
And I think it is hopefully sort of a key element and the last milestone to, as I like to say, unleash the full power of real-world data.
Yeah.
We're expecting to see, at least in oncology, all submission have some real-world data element, all regulatory submission have some real-world data element to them. And so, it's an exciting time to be in this field.
Yeah, it sounds like it. I think exactly to your point, this is something that we've seen, in a lot of different places, a lot of different industries for quite some time. But now it's time to unleash the beast and really just kind of, like let the data manifest and kind of see what we can do with it. And would love if you could share a little bit more about, what ConcertAI is doing and how they kind of utilize big data to apply it into the healthcare space.
ConcertAI, like most other companies in the field, pulled over these guidances, right? It was important for us to understand, were we going to have to take a different tactic? Where were we on point? There's a very important element where I think we were on point, is the element of human data curation. As you know, in oncology, a lot of the meaningful outcomes like progression-free survival come from unstructured fields, and so you need to curate these unstructured fields to bring them into structured fields so that you can actually mine them for research purposes.
Right.
And the guidance really pointed to the fact that having human manual chart review and adjudication as needed was what they set as the gold standard. They coined it complete verification. And in fact, it's what we've been doing. It's what ConcertAI has been doing for nearly 15 years.
Right.
And, and I think this is where, this is really where it starts. If you look at what makes curation or our approach to curation strong, it's at the heart of kind of what we do.
Yeah.
There's a few elements. That make curation robust. One element is let the science guide the curation. Make sure that the research questions, and as an epidemiologist, I like that. Make sure that the scientific purpose is what determines what you curate and how you curate it. So that's essential for us, and it's really
right.
It brings the second. As a consultant, I like to think in threes. The second.
No, I love it.
The second point for curation, I think, is essential. How we approach curation is the epidemiologists and biostatisticians on my team, the scientists on my team, they have an open dialogue with the nurses that are curating. And it's an iterative process, it's an ongoing dialogue. And it's important, especially when you're dealing with very hard to define populations, very rare conditions where to identify these patients, you have to look at multiple places within the chart. You have to have clinical expertise in that indication. You have to try certain elements and see how complete it is and then pivot. And that dialogue is really very unique and very important. I think is one of the main reasons why our data is high quality. And then the third element, because there has to be a third element, is the fact that the curators have access to the complete chart. And that's important. Some curation happens when you have access to one document, couple documents. And here curators have access to the full chart, and there's a complete picture, and you're able to navigate from the image to the labs, to the notes, in order to sort of put together a complete picture. And so I think it's the beating heart of what we do and what we develop is often, and that's our aim, is often regulatory submission purposeful. Like the data we curate is data that has regulatory intent and regulatory purpose, and it's kind of at the heart of what we do.
Absolutely. No, I love the threes, and I love that, you know, one of the core tenets really is that communication between, you know, the biotechnicians, kind of the folks on the team, as well as, you know, the care providers. I think having that open dialogue seems like it, you know, really yields high quality data that's coming from a meaningful place. So I like that you called that out, which is great. So I was going to ask you anyways about the curation process, but you gave me such a great three-pronged answer. So would love if you could share a little bit more about some of the AI models that are used and how ConcertAI uses things like that to help with the clinical development process.
Yeah. So AI, you know, is one of these buzzwords, right? That we
yes.
Look, I think that ultimately the 15 years of curation and it's an expertise that we've developed here has enabled us to have all this data that we can leverage to build AI models. And how do we use the AI models? In many ways. We use the AI models to accelerate insights. They help with curation. So you could, you know, the AI model might say, look, we've noticed that in this indication for a patient like the one you're looking at, these are documents, or these are fields, or these are key terms that were important. So they'll highlight them for the curators, and the curator, it won't replace it. That's very important. That's what we talk about human data curation. We don't want to replace it with AI models that have not been validated. It doesn't necessarily replace it, but it accelerates and facilitates the job of the curator. In fact, it's an intelligent model. The more we curate these types of patients, the more we learn. And so it's very much, you know, also an AI-driven company. It's tech AI, and RWD is sort of the nexus of this company. So of course, there's a way in which we see a way to innovate with all this data we have.
Absolutely. And I like how you kind of talked about AI being used as guideposts, but still, you know, just another tool in an already very robust process. I think that's incredible. I want to put on your, you know, clinical trial hat for a second. You know, would love to kind of get your perspective when it comes to, you know, clinical trial study design, some of those types of work, you know, that you probably have a lot of experience in. What are some ways or things that you've seen that can be improved upon? You know, what advice would you have for organizations or individuals that are kind of starting to design a study to make it more impactful?
Right. Look, no, I think that being at the nexus a little bit of clinical development, we have the clinical development team and real world data kind of opens up a little bit a wide range of hybrid designs. And then, you know, looking at how to bring the innovation to this decade. So one example I can think of is gene therapies are a great clinical advance, but it's still unclear what the long-term safety and effectiveness of these therapies might be, right? And so imagine you run a clinical trial, you give your patients a gene therapy. The trial lasts a year. It's a one-time therapy. Trial lasts a year. You submit it for approval. You get approved. The regulators still want to see long-term follow-up. They want to understand what the safety and clinical implications of that therapy might be. And it's and sometimes they want to see 5, 10, 15 years of long-term follow-up. And it's hard to think of maintaining a clinical trial over 15 years. Not only because of the financial implication, but also because of the attrition. You would have a lot of patients that would fall out. And so one of those areas of innovation for us is this ability to think, can we take these patients from the clinical trial and can we have them consent to roll over into a decentralized phase, right? Something
interesting.
We've been thinking of a little bit for a few years, but now it's being accelerated again under COVID. People want to think of a decentralized option. And the ability to essentially passively continue to collect information on these trial patients, but they no longer have to come to the clinical sites. You can collect their EMR information as they're seeing their clinicians. So you can do that by consenting a random sample from that clinical trial or sample of patients from a clinical trial. Then you can augment it with other patients from the real world that are matched to have sort of a powered and sort of a larger long-term follow-up cohort. So these are some of these decentralized options are really some of the ways in which we can think of innovation. Look, another very important aspect, I think that is aligned a little bit with the values of the HITLAB is the ability to think of how can we tackle health inequities, right? And these health inequities have become even more obvious during COVID, where you had differential access to the vaccine, differential COVID, rates of comorbidities and the course of disease, which impacted cancer care, which impacted cancer outcomes as well. And it impacted people's involvement with research. So how can we start to think of bringing innovation to the field of health inequities is sort of one area that we're zeroing in on and having, again, for innovation, it's a matter of bringing a diverse set of people with a critical mind, intellectual curiosity, and then you need to bring rigor to identify those pursuits that are going to actually have an impact from sort of cool but maybe futile pursuits. So that's the next area for us, I think.
I love that. I think that's incredible to be able to really zero in on exactly some of the things that you were talking about as it relates to health inequities. And going back to your first example about, is there a transition point that we can kind of take for, the folks in these clinical trials so that it's not as much of a burden on them as well. Wanted to kind of ask you a little bit more about some of like the patient retention, things that you have seen. What are some other ways that, you've seen practices work when it comes to patient retention within these clinical trials, especially, just to bring in the inequity piece, sometimes folks don't have the time to give the resources to really, be all in with these clinical trials.
Yeah, no, it's a super important question. Look, I mean, if you think about it, 5% of oncology patients are in trials. And, a lot of it has to participate in trials. A lot of it has to do with the majority of these cancer patients are receiving care in community practices, not necessarily in academic settings. And we tend to engage with academic settings more when we run trials. And I think, look, when you're talking about retention, before even talking about retention, you want to talk about increasing representativeness.
Absolutely.
In your trial. And in order to do that, you have to really have a commitment to seeing diversity in the patients you sample from. You have to sample them from community settings as well as academic settings. And ConcertAI understood that fairly quickly. I mean, and it's a blueprint really that you can think of to use for that. It's a good start, but it's certainly not. There's still some work to be done for the full industry. But
Absolutely.
the more, if you go to small practices and large practices, urban and rural practices, academic and community settings, bring the diversity, a larger geographic footprint in order to increase external validity. And look, we're realizing that there's a big element that differentiates, that sort of opens up that diverse aspect is around, do you narrow which EMR systems you allow for your research, or do you stay agnostic, right?
Right.
And in many ways, the ability to stay agnostic to these EMR systems, when we notice that we end up having a larger, more representative pool of patients, and sort of insights that uncover regional differences, that cover different treatment approaches that you really want to gain clinical insights on. So I'm answering your question, but not quite. The first aspect of it, making sure that you're starting with a generalizable, a diverse, representative sample of patients. Absolutely. This is a place I think it's good to see the whole field really be laser focused around that. Retention. Look, we talked about some hybrid approaches, right? Can you decentralize a little bit? Can you make patient burden a little bit easier by bringing in some passive data collection wherever you can, making sure that real world data collection remains robust and is done per regulatory expectations or guidance is going to be key for that.
Absolutely. No, I think that's incredible. And I love that you called out, it kind of starts with representation just within the initial intake when it comes to these patients in clinical trials. I love that you called that out. And then on that note, what other things would you kind of like to see, big data, healthcare, health tech move so that we are, really, designing with impact and with, meaning behind everything that we're doing?
Yeah, no, I think it's important to also keep the finger on the pulse of. Let's remember what we're all doing here. We are improving patients' lives, right? This is sort of the aim of our research, and so I think having access to the patient's experience, either through the patient directly or through the providers or the clinics that provide the care, I think is important. In order to interpret the data and understand these differences. And so I think access to the provider sites is key, and relationships with provider sites is key. Look, there are other areas that are coming to the fore. There's areas of imaging, right? Do we interpret images, or do we have access to the original image for interpretation, right? There's a lot of different ways in which an image can be interpreted, and I think that the differences in interpretation is another important area for regulators. They want to see more consistency set there. So having the ability to really bring in that image or that original lab data, or that gene profiling, that genomics profile, alongside the real world data, alongside the EMR data, I think is going to just improve the quality of the real world data we mine, and it will increase the use. And again, when you promote use of real world data, what you're really doing is you're promoting the fact that you have vulnerable populations that are underrepresented in trials, and that you have patients that are underrepresented, maybe because they are, they have comorbidities, they're older, certain race and ethnicities are underrepresented. When you have better real world data, you are able to expand the image to these more vulnerable populations.
Absolutely. No, I love how you talked about imaging actually, but also metaphorically as well, when it comes to just seeing the bigger picture. So I think that's incredible. And this is kind of a question that we typically ask a lot on Women's Health Tech Wednesdays. what are some of the trends that you are seeing in health equity as it relates to women's health? Is there anything that's kind of on your mind, or that you're just seeing in, in the work that you do?
Sure. Look, I think it goes to different places. First of all, I'm seeing more women around
Yes.
me doing the research, right? And so there's a, I think we talked about increasing the pool of women whose data we have access to. So that's important, right? And they are one of the vulnerable, in some indications, in some cases, one of the vulnerable populations, maybe underrepresented population, especially in some narrow ethnicities. So that's a given. And let me reiterate it here because that's important. But I think having diverse teams that I see in my work where, there's more women at the table that are providing their perspective and their experience, and also a more diverse set of race and ethnicities that I think improves the interpretation of the data we see. And so I like that. I like that trend.
I love that,
and I want to continue seeing it.
Absolutely. And I really like that you talk about representation, in different tiers. It's not enough to just have it in a specific aspect of a practice or, an organization, but it really needs to be kind of the ethos throughout the way in which the industry works. So I love that you called that out. So I know that we have a minute left. So we always like to end our conversations by asking you, throughout your illustrious career, what words of advice do you have for the, health tech community?
Well, can I do it in threes as well? Because I like
Yes, I love it. I love the threes.
So look, I think I want to end there. I want to say it one more time. Let's remember why we're doing this, right? This is public health endeavor. We are lucky and privileged to help in some way improve public health. And so that should be at the forefront of everything we do, always, every day. Hire and surround yourself with open-minded, curious people and enable an innovative environment, right? Nurture it. Make sure that there's an environment where people feel safe having ideas and sharing them, and there's this meritocracy of ideas, as we like to call it.
Love that.
That I think is important. And then look, I've been here for a few years. Remain humble. Sort of put aside your preconceived notion in everything you do. And the people you work with, the data you look at, and be open to a sense of discovery when, with years, in fact, it's interesting, sort of thinking, well, I kind of know the answer to this. You start to think, well, I've been surprised before. I have this knowledge. Let me set it aside and let me start with an open mind, and a listening and the ability to listen and to sort of discover. So I think this is a dynamic field. Unless you engage in that way, what we knew yesterday is not going to be what the healthcare field will look like tomorrow. And so I think you need to keep the sense of discovery and of curiosity in order to meet the demands of this new healthcare environment.
Absolutely. Spoken like a true innovator. Wanted to thank you so much, Nathalie, for taking the time to chat with us today. It was such an insightful conversation, and I think really, makes me very excited about just all the different ways that, big data and health tech are kind of moving to create meaningful impact. So really appreciate you taking the time. For those that still have questions for Nathalie, please be sure to check out her LinkedIn. Feel free to message her so that you can kind of continue the conversation on that platform. I also wanted to let everyone know that next week we'll be speaking with Rita McGrath, so please be sure to tune in next week. And we also have our symposium tomorrow. So check that out. All the registration information is in the chat. Wanted to give one shout out to our sponsors, Goodwin and Witham, for sponsoring this conversation. And one last huge thank you to our guest, Nathalie. Thank you so much, Nathalie. Have a good rest of the day, everyone. Thank you. See you next week.
Bye, everyone.